Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What are the United Nations Millennium Development Goals to reduce abject poverty, to empower women, and to promote sustainable development? What will happen when these goals expire December 31st, 2015? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations Millennium Development Goals and, more importantly, what will happen to them once they expire December 31st, 2015. My guest today is an expert on these goals and what will happen next. My guest today is Ms. Amina J. Mohammed. Ms. Mohammed is the Special Advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations for Post-2015 Development Planning. Ms. Mohammed was the CEO and founder of the Center for Development Policy Solutions. She was also inducted into the Nigerian Women's Hall of Fame in 2007. Amina J. Mohammed, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you. Real pleasure to be with you.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into post-2015 development goals, but let's talk a little bit about the process and how the Millennium Development Goals were formed in 2000. Whose idea was it to develop these goals? And if you could identify 8 of them very briefly, and then we'll talk as to some of the successes that have taken place over the last 14 years or so.
Well, the occasion of the Millennium Development Goals is just as it says, at the millennium. And at that time, a number of decades that were signed on to by different agencies of the United Nations, education for all, health for all, were all being reviewed, what had happened in that last decade. And I think there was a moment in time when it's suddenly a realization, so many people still in poverty, what could we do about it? There's a great momentum for the new millennium. And so under the leadership of Kofi Annan, they came up with taking what was really the absolute minimum that we could put together and promise to people, promise to the poor, that we would do over a period of 15 years. And that was really the beginning of the MDGs, taking from health and education, poverty, water. The 8 MDGs came about after the Millennium Declaration, which really was a commitment by all member states to say we're going to address poverty in the developing world. So the goals started, of course, with the eradication of poverty, starting by reducing it by half. We then went to the gender goal, education, the 3 health goals that addressed maternal, child, and the diseases. We had water and sanitation, the environment, and then we looked to the gender goal. 8th goal was the partnership goal, we called it, which was all about debt, trade, and aid. So these 8 goals as an integrated whole, trying to invest in them and achieve them over a period of time in partnership with our donors and others.
Mm-hmm. And these goals, now these are issues the UN deals with every day. They have since probably 1945 in some way, shape, or form. But it was so critical to, I won't say simplify them, well, yeah, maybe standardize them to 8 logical, practical, measurable goals that groups could sign on to. You see that service clubs like Rotary International, Lions International, Kiwanis, you have faith-based groups, businesses, the private sector, so many different organizations, in fact, I would say hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of people out there have been working on these goals because they could identify with them. Would you think that is the case?
Very compelling agenda. There wasn't one single goal that you wouldn't say to someone, this doesn't matter. Reducing poverty in the lives of many, nobody would say no to that. Certainly saving women's lives in childbirth, ensuring that children had immunization and that you tried to save them from preventable diseases, that women had equal opportunity, especially our girl child. Access to portable water, just drinking water that we take for granted here, we turn the tap on, just wasn't available. Sanitation. These were really important. Then there was the scourge of HIV and AIDS, malaria, TB, really addressing those issues. It was a compelling agenda, an agenda that you needed politicians to listen to. They were a good set of goals to advocate for. So civil society, like you said, the Rotary Club was very good at mobilizing resources around these issues. They were also easier to measure. You could come up with, measurements, and you could advocate and make sure that those that were in a position to do something about it did. It began to create new partnerships and awareness of how many challenges that we had. And certainly, I think over the years that I was involved with government in trying to use the resources we had to achieve the MDGs, we saw a lot of difference in bringing communities into the discussion. And again, then seeing what other challenges that we had that remained.
Exactly. Now, I know some of the countries will achieve all 8 of the Millennium Development Goals, some will achieve some of them. How are we doing? Have we accomplished any of the goals up to this point? Are there some where we're lagging that maybe we need to focus our interest or to increase our really attention to try to achieve them?
It actually seems just like yesterday we started them. We've now got 534 odd days left. On the poverty goal, we managed to achieve that, reducing poverty by half. The gender goal, in some countries, gender parity we did get, but there's still much more to be done on that. The education goal as well, many countries got all children into school for a complete cycle. The challenges remain with the quality of it, the quality of education that one receives. Can you read and write adequately coming out of school? The 3 health goals, we saw enormous progress on the maternal health goals, where less women now are dying in childbirth, but still not enough. The diseases, preventable diseases for children. I mean, the one thing we did see was immunization, and in particular polio. See a great progress being had, reduced now to about 3 countries in the world, which is incredible. Access to potable water, we got that goal, and also that of reducing the number of slum dwellers. We're still doing not so well on sanitation. So I'd say that we had made a great deal of progress in some areas, much more to do, which is why you see us speak to the acceleration in achieving the MDGs, and that there are special initiatives that the SG has put together, like the education one, to ensure that we address quality education. The disparities within and amongst countries also exist. So while we would say this happened in the whole, there are many of our countries that within pockets, inequalities really that we've seen in access to everyone getting a chance to engage with the economy or access to health, education. So lots more to do, but I think that this has been really an incredible journey, one that we've seen much success. So we know it can be done. I think that's the good news, is that it can be done, but we must take it to scale.
And of course, there's plenty of time to still get involved. If people would like to, they could go into UN.org and get more information about the Millennium Development Goals. They could Google it, and they could probably just contact a group that they're a member of, be it a service club or a faith-based group, and undoubtedly, I would say most of them are involved in trying to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. Well, we talked about the MDGs up to through 2015. What will happen after 2015? You're in charge of trying to bring all the players together. What exactly can we expect January 1, 2016?
I think first a recognition that the job is unfinished. And so member states, when they came out of the Sustainable Development meeting in Rio in 2012, one of the commitments they made was that this time they would get involved. If there was ever a criticism of the MDGs, it was that it was done by the United Nations and its experts in a sort of inclusive, closed way. But this time member states decided they needed to take ownership and leadership and set themselves up with a 3-year journey to designing the next set of successor goals. So the MDGs have worked because they've got traction for another set. And that's a process that member states of the United Nations have been involved in. They've set up 2 key groups. One is to fashion out recommendations for the next set of goals. The second is to look at what sort of financing framework would we need to resource these goals. It's one thing to have a nice menu, but someone's got to pay for it somehow. The difference is this time is that we're not just going to be looking at the poverty agenda. That will be the overarching objective of this. We've still got 1 billion people living below the poverty line. But it will be about a sustainable development agenda. How can we speak about now bringing in both social inclusion, economic inclusion, and protecting the environment into one. That, of course, will be concluded in September 2015. We should then have another set of goals and a financing framework to do this with.
Now, you were talking about inclusion, and is there an opportunity for the general public to tie into this process to say, well, I think eradicating poverty is very important, or I think promoting sustainable development, combating climate change? Can they get into this process?
Absolutely. Right from the onset, this has been an inclusive process. The Secretary General has made sure that we've been able to do the outreach to all constituencies. They've been able to come into the processes in the United Nations. We started off with a high-level panel of eminent persons that was chaired by 3 heads of state and government, and that was the first time we really outreached to young people, to different constituencies of those with disabilities, women, children, all came and their voices came in. We also provided a platform, a social media platform through the UN Millennium Campaign that we looked for people's voices about the kind of world they would like to see. It was the world we want on My World. And that's been really helpful because it has put into perspective how close or far away we are with people's aspirations. This is a universal agenda. It's not just about North and the South of the globe. It's about all of us. It's about leaving no one behind. And so for that reason alone, there really is an impetus about we must get everybody's voice on board.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations Millennium Development Goals that were launched in 2000, will run through 2015, and what will happen when these goals expire. My guest today is an expert on the MDGs. My guest today is Ms. Amina Mohammed, who is the Special Advisor to the Secretary General for the post-2015 Development Planning. We're talking about the Millennium Development Goals and now what will happen January 1st, 2016. And you mentioned the platform that you had, and I want to make sure I get this right. It's www.myworld2015.org, 2015.org. And so our viewers can go to this, they can tap into it, they can register the issues that are important to them, and they will be counted.
Absolutely. We have over 2.5 million people so far that have engaged with looking at this set of 16 questions that we have there about the sort of world that you want. And more or less you see different regions say different things, but we've seen a great deal that underscore the importance of health, of education, of responsive government. So yes, I would encourage everyone, go to that site and have your say. It's an incredible opportunity to be a part of this.
Now, in the past, we've seen that so many different groups are interested in the issues at the United Nations. I mentioned Rotary, they're involved in the UN, establishing the UN in 1945 in San Francisco. But you also see faith-based groups and a variety of others involved, environmental groups and what have you. But it seems there's another group, the private sector. Businesses seem to be more interested today in what the UN is doing through poverty eradication, through sustainable development. Are you encountering that in your discussions with leaders and getting people involved in this process?
Absolutely. I mean, the 2 new players that have come into the discussion on the next development agenda have been business, so they will be a key part of what we need when we talk about our economic transformations. I mean, you'll know that one of the biggest challenges we have is young people with no jobs, no livelihoods, and so really getting business involved and partnering with government and partnering with others in the communities is a big part of this. It's been a real task because we don't necessarily speak the same language. We do development and they do business for profit. But we've seen that, there's a convergence around, we're all involved in this. This world is ours, and we need to protect the planet. We need to put people at the center. So you can make, decent profit, but with people and not without them. So that discussion's been really encouraging. The other, of course, element is the new partners, parliamentarians. And in trying to deepen democracies, these are important stakeholders who do take responsibility for the investments that we need, the money that goes into a budget to pay for teachers' salaries or for inputs into the health sector. These are all really important parts of it, and they have that responsibility. They also have one for accountability, the oversight of what happens to public money. And that's been a real debate over the years as we look at governance and the challenges of corruption. So this is really an important part of what we continue to speak about and bringing young people into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the 68th General Assembly of the United Nations General Assembly introduced a concept, or a paper, I guess it was a report, Life of Dignity for All. What were some of the major concepts that came out of that, a life of dignity for all? I know there were 4 or 5 that were of great interest to you.
Absolutely. I think once we had had the big outreach and the high-level panel, the UN system feeding in, what his report did was capture people's voices and also his vision of what a new sustainable development agenda should look like. The first was the universality, that being about all of us and our roles and responsibilities in ensuring that we eradicate poverty. The second was really about the Sustainable Development Agenda itself, that how do we integrate social justice, inclusive economy, so you don't have economies growing without people and these huge inequalities that we see, that middle-income countries today have the most of the poor. Then the third we had was economic transformations, going beyond a pilot project, really talking about scale, turning around people's economies that give jobs to our young people, that use technologies to really do that leapfrogging that we need to do, but also that include issues around migration and the challenges that we have, as I said, for jobs for all. The fourth was the partnership one, really looking at the means of implementation. In other words, how do we get the resources to do all of this? And that brings business in. It also makes us really look to see how we can unlock the resources and get a better distribution of wealth around. And last but not least, to do this huge transformative agenda, the international community is going to have to be fit for purpose. So how do you get the necessary skills and the commitment, restructure yourselves to help countries do this when they say leave no one behind and ensure a life of dignity for everyone.
And of course our viewers can go to www.un.org to tap into what we're talking about today and many other issues. These are so vitally important, all 5 of them. Maybe we start at the back and work our way forward. The number 5 is fascinating, fit for purpose. How do you bring people into this? How do you train them, and how do you make sure that they have the skills that are necessary to help achieve the future Sustainable Development Goals and to help create a better world? That's what we're talking about, to provide employment, to reduce abject poverty and those types of things. But what are some of the ideas that are coming out to do this, to accomplish it?
Well, first starting, I think, from the UN that has this remit to do it. We have country teams in most countries where we help and we partner with government to try to put together plans and implement them in the health and the education sector, economic activities. All these now need to be an integrated whole. We're not talking about the silos anymore. So the skill sets for that that we need in the United Nations will require different ways of training us, modules that will respond to that. And we see our UN Staff College engaging with that currently on how we do that. The agencies are so different and varied. We have the concept of delivering as one at the country level, and that's been around a poverty agenda. Now we're saying that you need to think about this in its different dimensions, bringing them together, so that if we talk about sustainable agriculture and we're investing in how we farm, produce that, store it, take it to market, what's the role of women in that? So therefore gender will come into that. To a large extent, we'll also be looking at some of the health issues and nutrition. So they will also come into that question. Now, once these skill sets we have, then we can begin to impart them and encourage multi-stakeholder dialogue with governments, so they can use these issues in different levels of government and in different constituencies to try to make sure that you've got resources, you have a plan, and this is the way we get it done. So that's been perhaps the biggest challenge, an assumption that we know what to do. But now I think as the member states start to tease out some of these goals that we have, sustainable energy for all, what does that really mean on the ground? How do we have less of a footprint and decarbonize our world, less emissions so that we can protect the planet? Well, sustainable energy is one of them, that we look at solar power, that we look at hydropower. And you could have a mix of all this, wind power, necessarily just one or the other. And that means technologies, so transfer of those. It's, again, one thing to transfer the technologies. It's another one to be able to use it. So preparing countries for that. a part of what we see the UN as a team, as a family, doing in that partnership with states, with governments.
Now, number 4, I believe, was peace and governance. We've already alluded to that to some degree. Do you find that these conflicts that are raging, the one in Syria, the one in Iraq, there are other places too, there are problem areas. How have they impacted this whole process? I know it's very difficult to get the leaders who are fighting civil wars to concentrate at times on some of these items, but have they factored into your discussions?
Very much so. I mean, today when we're designing the development agenda, we have to think of the environment in which we are about to make these investments. And in many cases where the poor are, where we have the greatest challenges with women, they are areas of conflict. In Africa, in the Arab world, different kinds of conflict in Latin America, organized crime. And we have to take all of that into consideration. This makes it more difficult, and this is where we talk about the peaceful societies and we talk about governance. Governance, because you want really to strengthen institutions and give those skills that we need to address access to justice, to health and education and so on and so forth. But the peaceful societies is important. We should be making the investments in development to prevent the conflict to begin with. You invest in people, you invest in young people, then you don't exclude them. And when you don't exclude people and they're a part of that society and they have a vested interest in it, you protect it. And I think that this is what we didn't do so well in the past. Then we have another dilemma coming out of conflict, which is what we all hope we can work towards. Then you need the peace building. That's a different kind of investment in development. It takes many more years to build back the trust in societies and communities that were knit before and now in a very different place. Seeing young people, institutions, infrastructure rebuilt again. So that's investment in the longer term. And so these different types of approaches are what has been discussed and we're contending with. I think there's a very real concern that we do have the 3 pillars that uphold the United Nations, the rights pillar, the development one, and the peace and security. And they all have their mandates and responsibilities, but they are interlinked. You can't have peace without development, and you can't have development without peace, and all of them really have to have the respect for the rule of law and rights. That's really important at this point.
It certainly is. And of course that all ties into economic transformations, number 3, and this is a chronic problem. This is a major problem, not in every country, but in a vast number of them. I know Egypt has a large number of unemployed youth, many countries do, and it's so critical to find employment opportunities, and so these people can be productive members of society and achieve their self-actualization. Are we moving forward in that area as far as suggestions to help overcome unemployment?
I think we are. We're not just talking about decent jobs, which are critically important, and we want the investments in countries. So when we talk about economic transformations, manufacturing, industrialization, these will provide jobs. But I think we're also talking about entrepreneurship, and we're finding young people engaging that really much better than I've ever seen before. They also do it across borders because the media now and internet makes that possible. So we are making those investments. I think we need to do a lot more on financial inclusion, so that when you find entrepreneurs, especially women, young women coming into that field, that these are accessible and that they can be part of it. I think for once, there is a great emphasis being put on everyone being part of this agenda. Long has gone the days where you just invest in one half of the community. It is about everyone, and I think the MDGs have really shown the importance of bringing women into decision making, into the business place, having access to the same rights and opportunities that young men have.
What, up to this point, what have been some of the major challenges you've run into as you've spearheaded this process? It's a very elaborate process, very complex process, very important, but what are some of the major challenges you've encountered?
I think conceptually the whole spirit of universality, the development agenda has, generally speaking, just been about one section of the world, and it's either Southeast Asia or Africa. But when we look at the development agenda today, because we're thinking of climate change, because our economies are inextricably linked, when the global financial crisis happened, everyone took its toll on every region in the world. And because, the effects of exclusion, inequalities, and leaving people behind have touched all of us, with the horror stories we see of forced migration, of the way in which young people are so involved in conflict and can be used that way. I think these are all important issues that have brought this to the fore, and the urgency of it, that it matters for all of us. So universality has been a particularly difficult thing to contend with.
It certainly would be, and we have to keep in mind too that there are 193 countries
Absolutely.
in the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly. They bring in every religious concept in the world, or religious persuasion, economic system in the world, moray,
ideology,
folkway, values, ideology. And it's amazing, and a tribute to you and your team and to the folks who are participating, that you've been able to move this far, this fast, with so much diversity, and it's really a tremendous accomplishment. But you have to have that universality. You have to have people buy into it. Governments have to buy into it. The business community has to buy into it, because if they don't, they will not participate. But it's very, very important to do this. But Amina Mohammed, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.